Welcome back. Today we're going to run through a very important exercise for Palantir investors in terms of what Palantir commercial is worth and how much of it is actually captured in the stock price. So I want to run through a few things here on the commercial sales, commercial growth rate, put a multiple on that, get a valuation, show you a different formula, and ultimately get to what I think a fair valuation for Palantir commercial is through the end of this decade here. First, I want to show you that I was getting my data here from a FactSet, and here's the segmentation of Palantir government and commercial. So what I was looking at for this exercise is Palantir's commercial growth rate annually was 17% in 2019, 22% in 2020, ramping up to 34% in 2021. And the numbers coming in at $340 million in 2018, almost $400 million in 2019, nearly $500 million in 2020, and over $600 million in 2021. So we already know the growth is there. But the reason I bring this up is I consider it a fairly interesting thought exercise because of how much Palantir is portrayed as this government contractor, because they really are. But what I'm thinking as an investor is, does Palantir's business, or perhaps its multiples, its public perception, get dragged down by the fact that it is considered strictly a government contractor when its commercial business is really, in my opinion, the story to be interested in? So you have all of these articles, you have all of these investors focused on the government business, the risks there, but in this video, I want to make clear that I am very happy to own Palantir and part of that be the commercial business, but also the government business is something we need to see what the impact is on the valuation. Would Palantir's valuation be much larger if it were just the commercial business? I think that could be the case, but let's dive in here. So I've put in the growth rates and the sales that we just looked at and potential price to sales ratio. I was just saying maybe it was price to sales for Palantir commercial 15, and then we had a peak of 35 in early 2021 or so to get that $23 billion valuation, half of what ended up being Palantir's valuation in the $40 billion. So that's why there's that spike there. But basically, if we assume Palantir can grow 30% through the end of this decade with its commercial business, I think they'll do more than this early on in the next few years and likely less in the following few years. But ultimately, I would not be surprised if that 30% averages out over the next decade. I think that is a likely outcome. And what that comes to is $800 million rather, in sales this year for commercial, crossing $1 billion in sales next year. And you get the idea, all the way over $6 billion looking at the year 2030, which would be a 10x from last year. So if Palantir can 10x its commercial sales in give or take 10 years, 9 years or so, I really do think its price to sales could be even farther north than 8 times sales. If it's still growing at 30%, it really should be much more than that. But let's just give it a conservative 8 times sales, and we'd assume Palantir's very profitable by this time. But just in terms of the price to sales ratio, we're landing at a valuation over $50 billion just for the commercial business. Now, there is this formula that I want to show you from David Cummings on a SaaS valuation and a way to actually value these SaaS companies. Now, this is much more, I believe, for private SaaS companies. It doesn't really apply very well to the public markets, but I just want to apply it nonetheless. And I did some back testing, and actually it seems like for the public markets, it's 2 to 3 times higher than what it would be for a much smaller company that doesn't have huge cash reserves and all of that. So I've applied a multiplier, but it does come very much in line with what I'm expecting if you look at it over time on this green line here, with what you could say for price to sales ratio. And then you see actually the formula with taking into account, let me just show it one more time. It takes into account the sales and then the growth rate, and then multiplies and adds those together for this formula that is supposed to give you a rough idea around what the company could be worth given it's a SaaS business. So you'll see, I really think Palantir's valuation could be much better understood if the commercial business was considered separate than the business it is today with government being intertwined. I'm not saying Palantir needs to split the two physically. I'm saying I think investors need to do a better job of understanding how the two are different, because Palantir does get a lot of synergies having engineers working together cross-functionally across the teams that they would not get otherwise if these were separated into two different companies. So I'm not calling for that, but we average these two together, we get Palantir north of $50 billion as a valuation for the commercial business. Now, why is this interesting? Well, Palantir sits at about a $16 billion business today. So for Palantir to be, let's say, $53 billion in 8 years from now, that's very interesting because the valuation for commercial is more than three times what the company is worth today. So this is assuming the government business died off, it disappeared, it's no longer there, which is obviously not going to be the case. We've seen Palantir growing. The growth has slowed a bit, but I believe there are some really important government contracts on deck, NHS, and the other ones that we've been hearing about for the longest time that I think are still in the pipeline and will still hit the financials later this year, next year.
At Palantir, we are proud to have supported the NHS with our software Palantir Foundry. Foundry integrates data from multiple disparate sources to derive insights, model courses of action, and improve outcomes. In the first few weeks of the pandemic, the NHS team used Foundry to build data dashboards that gave local and national leadership the true picture of infection spread and critical care capacity. And over the following year, the NHS team used Foundry to build dozens of tools that decision makers across the country used every day to manage oxygen capacity, allocate the stock of ventilators, and ensure the availability of PPE. Foundry gave the NHS a consistent source of truth to support decisions at every level of the organisation, providing transparency and inspiring confidence.
As well as all of the other new contracts that the sales team has been working on. All that aside, the government business is still one that I would like to be invested in, and still one that I'm very confident in. Specifically, I'm just not as confident in it as I am with the commercial business. If I could pick one or the other, I would pick the commercial business. Faster growth, better understood by investors, but we don't have that choice. So I'm saying if we can understand where the commercial business is going, we can understand where Palantir stock as an entity is going to end up. So Palantir will 3x its valuation based on these numbers with the commercial business alone. So let me know what you think in the comments, but I think it's very important to understand Palantir's valuation, or rather its multiples, could be higher if it were just on the commercial side versus getting a multiple compression or contraction with its work on the government side and confusing investors that don't actually take the time to split apart the two. So let me know what you're thinking, and until next time.